ไปดูอมเพชรมันอมเพชรมันมาไหม
A magnitude 7.7 earthquake tore through the sea north of an Indonesian island before dawn Saturday, and residents had about 5 minutes of warning before a tsunami alert told them to run. At least 20 people are dead, and that number is expected to climb. Here is what actually happened and why the same fault line has done this before and will do it again. The earthquake struck at 5:58 in the morning local time Saturday, with an epicenter about 42 miles or 68 kilometers north-northwest of the city of Ende in Indonesia's East Nusa Tenggara province. The United States Geological Survey measured it at magnitude 7.7 at a depth of just 6 miles or 10 kilometers. Indonesia's Meteorology, Climatology and Geophysics Agency, known as BMKG, the country's equivalent of the National Weather Service and the U.S. Geological Survey combined, issued a tsunami warning within minutes for the surrounding coastline. 3 aftershocks followed within the next 30 minutes, measuring magnitude 5.9, 5.6, and 6.1. Around the port town of Maumere, rescue crews have confirmed at least 20 deaths, 6 injuries, and 2 people still trapped under collapsed buildings as of Saturday morning local time. The tsunami warning was lifted after tide gauges recorded waves under 3 feet or 1 meter. Search and rescue operations are ongoing. Investigators have not finished assessing how many buildings collapsed or how high the final death toll will climb, and that number is likely to change over the next several days. What is not in question is the tectonic setting that made this possible, and that part has been understood for decades. So why does this stretch of ocean keep doing this? 3 things about the geology here explain both this earthquake and the reason it barely surprised seismologists. The first is depth. This quake ruptured just 6 miles down, which is shallow by earthquake standards. Depth changes how violently the ground moves at the surface, in the same way a speaker sounds louder standing next to it than standing across the room. A magnitude 7.7 at 10 kilometers shakes the surface far harder than the same magnitude would 40 miles down. The second is the fault itself. North of Flores sits something called a back-arc thrust, a slab of crust being folded and shoved upward as the Australian plate grinds beneath the Eurasian plate to the south, similar to a rug bunching up when you push one end of it across a floor. Most people picture subduction earthquakes happening where 2 plates meet directly. This fault sits behind that boundary, closer to land, which means less distance and less time for a wave to travel before it reaches a coastline. The third is vertical motion. A thrust fault does not just shake the ground, it can lift or drop the seafloor in an instant, shoving the entire column of water above it, not just the surface. Picture lifting an entire tray of water rather than splashing the top of it. That displacement is what turns an earthquake into a tsunami. That combination is not new to this coastline. It still leaves the question of why Maumere and the towns along Flores's north coast keep absorbing the worst of it. Flores sits close enough to the fault that a tsunami here does not travel for hours, it travels for minutes. In December 1992, an earthquake on the same fault system sent a wave that reached parts of the coast in about 5 minutes, with run-up over 80 feet or 25 meters in the worst-hit bays, and it killed more than 2,000 people. Geologists who study the fault have documented at least 79 earthquakes above magnitude 6 along it since 1900, and 11 of those produced tsunamis. Much of the coastal building stock in this part of Indonesia is unreinforced masonry, brick and block walls without steel framing, built for a wet climate rather than a shaking one. That construction style tends to fail in a specific way. Walls crack and shed outward instead of flexing, which is why building collapse, not the water, is often the first source of casualties in these events before any wave arrives. If you live along a coast anywhere a fault sits close enough that the ground shaking itself is your only warning, you are living in the same category as Maumere, whatever ocean you're on. The warning system did what it was built to do. BMKG's tsunami network, built after the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster, issued its alert within minutes of the shaking and kept it active until tide gauges confirmed the waves stayed under 1 meter. That is close to the fastest a ground-based network can move. What did not fully hold up is the offshore buoy system meant to catch a wave in open water before it nears the coast. Maintenance records published by BMKG and the German researchers who helped build the network show that of the original deep ocean buoys, 22 were reported lost or damaged between 2012 and 2018, leaving gaps in the system's earliest layer of detection. What actually protected people on the ground Saturday was not a buoy or a siren. It was distance from the coast and higher ground, reached in the few minutes people had. For a quake this close to shore, the ground shaking itself functions as the only warning that arrives in time, and coastal residents here are trained to treat strong shaking as the signal to move, not to wait for an official alert. Rescue crews in Maumere described narrow streets blocked by collapsed shop fronts, slowing the search for the 2 people still trapped as of Saturday morning. Fatur Rahman, the head of Maumere's Search and Rescue Agency, roughly equivalent to a county emergency management chief in the U.S., said crews had found 20 dead and 6 injured, with 2 more still under rubble. One resident, reached by local broadcasters, described waking to the shaking and running for the hills above town, still in bedclothes, joining a line of neighbors doing the same. Officials have said the toll will likely rise as search teams reach areas cut off since the quake.
Is this fault becoming more active, or does it just feel that way because Flores keeps making headlines? The honest answer is that the historical record does not show a clear trend either way. What has changed is exposure. More people live along this coastline than in 1992, and more of that coastline has been built up in the decades since. What the data cannot yet tell us is how this earthquake will ultimately compare in size to 1992, or whether Saturday's shaking has changed the stress on the rest of the fault. Seismologists generally will not have that answer for months. So does any of this matter if you live nowhere near Indonesia? The United States has its own version of this exact setup, a fault close enough to a coastline that the shaking is the only warning you get. The Cascadia subduction zone runs along the coast of Oregon and Washington, and it is capable of a magnitude 9 earthquake with a tsunami reaching some beaches in 15 to 20 minutes. Alaska's Aleutian subduction zone has produced some of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, including the 1964 quake that sent a tsunami across the Pacific. Puerto Rico sits along the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the few places in U.S. territory where a major offshore fault sits close enough to a populated coastline that evacuation time could be measured in minutes rather than hours. If you live along any coastline in Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Puerto Rico, or Hawaii, and you would need to check a map to know your evacuation zone, that is worth fixing this week, not after the next warning. You cannot control a fault line. You can control how fast you move and how ready your household is before the ground starts shaking. Know your evacuation zone now, not during an event. Coastal counties in Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii publish tsunami zone maps online, and the address lookup takes about 5 minutes. Learn the difference between a warning you wait for and a warning you feel. If you are on the coast and the shaking lasts more than 20 seconds or is strong enough to make standing difficult, that is your signal to move to high ground immediately without waiting for a siren or a phone alert. That is a rule to memorize now, not figure out in the moment. Agree on a family meeting point above the tsunami line before anything happens. That is a 10-minute conversation tonight. And the one almost nobody checks. Standard homeowners and renters insurance in the U.S. generally excludes both earthquake damage and flood or tsunami damage. Each requires a separate policy, and earthquake coverage in high-risk zip codes can take weeks to activate after you apply. That is a phone call worth making this week, not after the next drill. FEMA's Tsunami Preparedness Guidance and your state's Coastal Hazards Office both publish zone maps and drill schedules specific to your address. Search teams in Mamere are still working through the morning, and the death toll is expected to change before this fault system is done being news this week. The pattern underneath it, a fault close enough to shore that the ground itself is the warning, is not unique to Indonesia, and it is not new. It showed up in 1992, it showed up again Saturday. If you live on a coastline anywhere near a subduction zone, go find your evacuation zone this week. Tell us in the comments if you already knew it.